Welcome to the Penguin Official Podcast. I'm your host, film critic Amy Nicholson. After each show episode, we invite the creators, writers, directors, cast, and crew onto the show to talk about all of the twists we just saw and how they made them. There will be spoilers. You've been warned. Episode 2 focuses its lens on the structure of organized crime in Gotham City. We learn more about the long feud between two families, the Falcones and the Maronis. Oz tries to play both sides like a double agent, feigning loyalty to the Falcones while attempting to deliver their drug operation to the Maronis. That plan does not work out as he intends. Almost none of the plans in this episode work out as anyone intends, and everyone, including Vic, has their mettle put to the test. First up, let's talk to writer and co-executive producer Vladimir Cvetko and special effects makeup prosthetic designer Mike Marino. Welcome. Thank you for joining us to talk episode 2.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Howdy.
Vladimir, before we jump too far into this episode, tell me a little bit about how you got to this show, how your own personal writing style, writing for television, meshed with the world of the Penguin.
So how I kind of came to the show is that Lauren LeFranc, the showrunner, and I worked together on a previous project. And so when she was doing this, she had written the pilot and pitched it, and HBO was picking it up. And so she came to me and was like, do you want to do something in this world? Like, are you interested? Do you like the pilot? It was amazing. And I was like, yeah, I mean, it's the Penguin, it's Gotham. I think like a lot of writers, like we all grew up with comic books. I would take my comic books camping with me. They're always in my backpack. So I was like, anything you want, like, it's just a thrilling opportunity to be able to write like exterior Gotham Street and then do your scene. It's how cool is that? But I mean, as far as like what really drew me in about it, and it started with Matt Reeves' Batman, is just how grounded and real and gritty the world feels, and that we're taking this Batman canon and we're distilling it down into something that feels like it could exist in our everyday world. Like we're kind of removing all the heightened aspect out of it, and that really appealed to me and my style because I like character work, I like crime, I like noir, and so I think it was just an opportunity to flex those muscles and really dive into it. So it's super cool.
How did it feel that first time you got to type exterior Gotham Street?
I screen grabbed it and saved it sent it to my wife. Yes.
You did not?
Yes.
What did she write back? A bunch of emojis? Or
yeah,
what?
She's very happy for me. So.
Well, Mike, Colin Farrell has mentioned your name in pretty much every single interview he's ever done for anything related to this. I mean, starting all the way back with the Batman. He said that your prosthetic work is why he wanted to play Oz Cobb in the absolute first place. Boy, hi. How's all that feel?
Hi there. Well, actually, Colin Farrell is such a great friend of mine. I've known him now maybe 15 years. We always enjoyed working with each other. And when I got a call to do The Penguin and I found out it was going to be Colin Farrell, I was very excited. He's the kind of actor that just goes for it. But, he's always been this very handsome movie star and a very, a character face, a very pretty face. But the Penguin, when you think of the Penguin, if you go back to the very beginning of Batman, the first appearance of Penguin, I mean, he does not look like Colin Farrell in any sense of the word, So you have this crazy looking guy in this striped suit and this big, long, beaky penguin nose and, this top hat and an umbrella. You don't think Colin Farrell. So over the years, the iterations of Burgess Meredith's Penguin for the 1966 Batman show and the 1992 Batman with Danny DeVito, Batman Returns, very different iterations of Penguin. And I think Colin Farrell's version of the Penguin is even different than all of them, but with the shadow of all of the original inspirations. So it was amazing working with Colin. But I do think that he was a little weary about it until he knew I was on board and until Matt and I had discussions on character. Matt and I had this very inspirational chat, very, very like two artists jamming in a studio. We were on the phone. We were talking about it for an hour plus, just talking about the character, talking about the movie. So I really kind of got the sense of where he wanted to go with it. And I think I surprised Colin and Matt by doing what I had done, because I just let inspiration take over what I thought the Penguin should be and what I thought the Penguin in this film should be.
And what was that?
So originally, Matt and I had spoke about maybe making Colin a little, changing the shape of his body, because Colin had gained a lot of weight for a role, but he lost it all. So Matt wanted that stocky quality of this, this intimidating gangster with this stocky appearance. But Colin said, "Listen, I am losing all this weight. I'm not keeping it on. So we're going to have to do it, with prosthetics and with a suit." So I was like, okay, cool. So instead of just taking Colin Farrell and, making him a heavier version, I really kind of delved deep into the characteristics of what I thought the Penguin should be. A character, instead of just a change of appearance, I thought maybe he was this really ruthless, low-level gangster who has been through hell to try to hold the position he was in. As far as the script was concerned, it told me enough about him as a character to bring my mind to visually think of what to do, with his look, with his characteristics. So I went a little bit overboard, what Matt and I had originally spoke about, but Matt really loved what I had done and wasn't quite thinking that far, and deep as Colin is completely obscured at prosthetics. But it went really well. We did a test. I showed him sculptures, and Colin was on board the whole time and said, as soon as I saw that sculpture of design, Colin knew how to play the part.
Well, I also heard that one of the tests you did, and this is just a vague story that I heard, is that he tested the makeup by wearing it out into the real world to a Starbucks?
Yeah, that is true. Well, after I had done my sculpture and we built the pieces, we built the wig and all this, and I actually had convinced Colin to shave part of his head. And I said, why don't you shave part of your head? I'll make a wig, a hairpiece that combs into your own hair so that it's like, less time in the chair and it'll look super real. So he said, okay. So we did the test in Warner Brothers studio in Burbank. And I think it was either nearby or on the lot. There was a Starbucks there. And we took the wig off, and he was just this heavy guy with this nose, bald pate, completely bald. And he went to order coffee at the Starbucks. And he goes, I just want to see if anyone recognizes me or treats me weird or whatever. So he went in there. They really wouldn't look him in the eye. They gave him his drinks and he left. And he had the voice, and he already in the test, he already had the voice. He was practicing his, let me get this and let me get that. They didn't bother him. They were a little scared, intimidated. And he walked out and he goes, holy shit.
Yeah, I gotta imagine, like, psychologically, you grow up looking like Colin Farrell. Your face becomes known as Colin Farrell. You don't get the pleasure of being ignored.
Right. And that's a lot of the time, a balancing act on what we do is there are instances where, you're aging someone or you're doing a makeup on someone where you don't want to lose who the actor is. You don't want to lose their face too much. This instance, you want the acting ability of a Colin Farrell, but it's important that he looks strange. It's important that he looks like a crazy gangster who'll shoot you in the head from behind. He has to look the part a bit. So Colin just looks like this really handsome, nice guy movie star. So he can't be the Penguin like that. So it gave him really the freedom to not have the limitation of being who he was, So I think he really embraced that.
I mean, it makes me wonder what a costume like this, what a look like this, what it means for the character itself psychologically. Vladimir, what is the mindset of Oz? I mean, do you think, the hammer toes, the walk, is he a person who considers himself handicapped? Am I even right in thinking that there was a moment in the first episode where he seems to choose to not sit in a handicapped seat on a train?
Yeah, and that was deliberate. Like he's not going to put himself below anybody for any reason whatsoever. And a lot of that is that Francis's conditioning. She didn't allow him to think of himself as lesser in any way. So he's not going to do it.
Well, yeah, and he's got these scars. I mean, Matt, when I look at Oz's face, I see a history in his scars. And I didn't know if there was this backstory even for, especially that most dramatic one, the one that kind of slashes cheek to mouth.
Well, I had done so much reference on the character, and I had looked at many soldiers from the past. And at the same time looking at birds, at reference for fighting birds and warbirds, eagles, penguins, kind of the alphas of the group. And a lot of the alpha birds have a real damaged appearance. They have chipped beaks. They have scars and chipped pieces of the beak, like as if they have been in battle over and over again. So that subconscious, I kept that in the back of my mind while sculpting. And I had these references of these World War I and World War II soldiers that had real brutal scars across their face. And they really looked tough. So being in Gotham, being in a mafia type of world in Gotham, if you're not a really aggressive soldier, you're not going to survive in that world. So I combined the bird aesthetics with a soldier, and I kind of combined them, and being a little heavier and having some acne scars and things, it really built these layers of character in this person's face. In order for someone like Oz to want to continuously rise in the ranks as a warrior in these streets, whether it be a moral person or not, that's the question you have to ask Vladimir and Lauren,
Well, yeah, and I mean, you're making me think of something, which is, what does it do to a person that they can't hide what they've done, where they've been? Like, there is a limit. When you're walking around with scars like this on your face, Vladimir, he can't really pretend he's some innocent guy who hasn't seen anything. He can't blend.
No. I guess. It's funny because we never quite put it that way. That like it's true. He stands out everywhere he goes, and he can't blend in. And yet he does have such a desire to be kind of accepted and somebody, right? Like he wants to be able to go to the expensive restaurant and not be thought of differently, and like he does want to be able to be so. But it's something that he's constantly going to have to push against as a character. It's his physicality. So, yeah, it must have a tremendous effect on him.
Well, and it's funny because Vladimir, like, there were moments watching this where I was like, oh, Oz is a mastermind. And then as soon as he gets through saying that, Sophia will just call him out as being an obvious phony. And then vice versa. Whenever I'm rooting for Oz as this underdog, he lets somebody get brutally killed. What are your personal feelings about Oz when you look back on this episode?
Well, so I was going to ask, like, when you say he lets someone get brutally killed, you mean Castillo at the end, right?
Yeah.
And then don't forget that he also guts Ervad. I think so much of this episode to me was about identity in our characters. And with Oz, you get to see all these different moments, all these different faces that he puts on, literally. You have the charmer at the party. You have the double agent, two-faced liar. You have the man who's kind of like sucking up to Sophia and trying to get in her good graces. You have honest Oz with Victor and how he's able to just be himself because he's let Victor into his life in that way. And then you have the comforting Oz, which is with his mother. And so to me, I think that was all about like the different facets of Oz. And so we shouldn't get our footing on there because he's like chaotically juggling as he's going. He has different personalities, if you go so far as to call them that, is a part of his ability to adapt and juggle and become whatever he needs to become. And then on the flip side, we have Sophia, who is also in this place of identity where she's come out of prison. She has the hangman name connected to her, and society is telling her who she is, and her family is telling her who she is. And she's trying to define who she is within her family and within her place. And now that she's lost Alberto, she's lost a big part of her identity, the one person who truly loved her and stood by her side. So, I think that, it's intentional. Like, we wanted this episode to really explore all the different pieces of these characters, and then also just to feel chaotic because Oz, and be there with Oz because he's just everything. He's just like a hair ahead of the next thing that goes wrong and has to switch, from moment to moment. So
yeah, it's almost like he's the cartoon coyote who runs off over the cliff, but if he keeps pedaling, maybe he can pull this off.
Exactly.
I mean, Mike, I want to ask about something very, very small, but Colin, to me, has, I would say, the most iconic set of eyebrows in Hollywood. And so much of his acting, in the films of his that I love, oh my gosh, in Bruges, eyebrows, very front and center. So where are they here? Are his penguin eyebrows on top of his eyebrows? For a person who acts with his eyebrows so much, did he have to learn new ways of moving his eyebrows? Can he not move his eyebrows as much as he's used to without messing up your work? What's happening here?
Right. So that was one of the things I really wanted to hide from him in the beginning. I really wanted to take those really distinct, almost caricatured. I look at every actor's face that I work with. I look at what are the features, almost in a sense, as a caricature artist would exploit something. If someone has small eyes or big nose or something, they'll draw something really big or really small or something and exaggerate teeth or something like that. So I said, well, what is exaggerating? What's the feature on Colin that everyone can see from a mile away? It's really his hair, his eyebrow shape, the gentle quality he has inherently with his eyes. So I said, okay, I need to try and experiment to try to lose these things. I don't want to have this makeup where it just looks like Colin with the same everything, because everything cohesively exists at one time. So I always think of just the entirety of the character, the entirety of the look. So that was one of the things I played with, where I had sculpted these eyebrows that I looked at real gangsters. I looked at, I basically grew up in somewhat of a Gotham. I grew up in New York, so Gotham was really kind of a riff on New York. So I grew up in a town where being young, I was exposed to many shady, strange characters, whether they be on the street or whether they would be in my family or, So one of the things I kept in mind was all those gangsters pretty much all of the time look nice. They all have nice suits. They all have nice hair. They all, even if they're really weird looking, they always take care of themselves. If I think of a gangster, I think of like cologne, like an excessive amount of cologne, So I looked at gangsters. I looked at many real life gangsters, and I looked at the shape of their eyebrows, and I looked at the shape of their faces when they were smiling, and I looked at the shape of their faces when they were angry. Some of the angry footage of some of the old gangsters from, the 30s, from the 50s, I took the shape of, if you look at someone like, and he was a very good actor from New York, Danny Aiello. If you look at Danny Aiello, you look at his face, you look at his eyebrows, he's got this shape. He's got this very distinct shape to his face, which in some of his roles, he's very charming. In some of his roles, he's really aggressive, and it hits like a switch like that. You could find many of those gangster type actors that have that switch. I had to change those innocent, nice guy eyebrows to kind of give the appearance of a gangster. And I did find a picture of a penguin that had the same kind of angle to his eyebrows. It was
the rockhopper, right? I grew up in a town with a SeaWorld. The rockhopper?
A boss penguin. They have these faces that look like this, and they have this long brow and these long eyebrows. So I kind of melded the two together and wiped out the handsome Colin Farrell eyebrow. And that's part of one of the looks of the character. That may speak about who he is without saying anything.
We have a lot of episodes of the show ahead of us, and I just want people watching this Colin performance to understand the full world of how it was created. So I want to ask this. Did he eat lunch on set looking like Oz?
Colin Farrell never showed up as Colin Farrell on set.
Never.
I mean, there would be moments where I knew I was talking to Colin, but he was still in the Oz voice, just because we had to communicate about certain things, like about the script. But like it was like yeah, he was just fully in it. It was wild. I mean, it was actually so wild to me because Mike, you guys were, you had to start your day so early to get this prosthetic on, and it's such an incredible piece of art. And it's so lifelike and so realistic, even when you're standing there, that Colin just disappeared into it. And I had this, kind of funny stories, like, because we're out there and we were actually staying in the same building, but and I was leaving and I saw Colin walking up the street coming back. And I had to do a double take because it was actually the first time that I had an interaction with him where he was not in the prosthetic, because he was always there, and I was like, that's you. Like it was really funny actually, but like it was really it's just I cannot say, having experienced that prosthetic in person every day, how incredible it was, how it moved with his face, how it moved with his eyes, how it moved.
Micro expressions.
Yeah, Mike, he could do it. He could control it. Like, it was really, Mike, I mean, it was just, it's amazing. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
But now I want to know, does Colin Farrell look even weirder when he's Colin Farrell with only half of his hair?
That was a nickname we created for that portion of the character named Carmine. That was Carmine, or that is hair. So there's many secret photos of Colin as Oz eating big giant pizza pieces and cannolis and all that.
Wait,
pastries.
Hold on, and we're talking about a show that had a big break in the middle because of the strike. Did he grow his hair back and shave it again?
Actually, the interesting thing was, for the film, he shaved his hair. He shaved it off, and then when we did the series. He asked, "Is there any way that I can keep my hair?" And I said, we really don't recommend it. It's going to take a lot longer in the makeup chair. And he goes, "Well, I'm doing all these other projects after this, and I don't have time to regrow it." I was like, "You pain in my butt." So basically, for the show, every morning we would start out, and we had the process of about an hour and 20 minutes of just flattening his enormous amount of hair down to his head before we even glued any prosthetics on of the penguin. So we had to flatten his hair halfway, partially, flatten it, paste it, glue it tight to his head, as tight as we possibly could with this whole system. And then once that was done, then we would glue the pieces on. Then we would start out where we started on the film, where we would glue the cheeks and glue the chin and glue all those things on. But it took a little longer, but at the same time, he had the luxury of having hair for the entire year, because with the strike, this took a year in the making. This was a year in the making.
This has been such a fun conversation, but I cannot wrap without asking about just my favorite tiny little throwaway line, because I'm still figuring out my footing in the tone of this show. It's violence, it's madness, it's filthy ambition, it's humor. And then you have this line in here, Vladimir, from one of Eve's girls: "Sometimes I work with cake."
Yeah, Roxy. Roxy was great, man. She was just perfect for like everything that we talked about in terms of coming up with kind of this like larger group that Oz has, because we wanted to show Oz as like a showman and somebody that always had people around him and stuff. But yeah, just in terms of lines like that, we always wanted to find humor and a bit of realness and just not take ourselves too seriously sometimes, because it's a dark show and there's a lot of dark subject matter in there. And so we aspired to make things a little weird and funny at times, and Roxy knocked it out of the park. It kills me every time.
What kind of cake should I be picturing? What's happening to this cake?
I don't know, man. That's not a wedding cake. I don't know. I think it's whatever you want, right? What's your favorite kind of cake?
Oh, carrot.
Carrot. Yeah. No, so raisins between the toes. Like, it's.
Oh, that's kinky.
Yeah.
All right, Vladimir, Mike, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, it was great. Thank you so much.
Next, we'll be joined by series creator, executive producer, and showrunner Lauren LeFranc. We've also got Michael Kelly, who plays Johnny Vitti, and Michael Zegen, who plays Alberto Falcone. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Lauren, I want to jump in with you. Tell us about these characters, Alberto and Johnny, and what you were looking for in casting people to embody them?
Well, they're part of the Falcone family. I think, with Alberto, he's a comic book character. Actually, there's Alberto, Sophia, and Mario in the comics, but Mario does not exist in our show. We
You just
kept it
killed
simple.
Mario?
We didn't kill him. We just didn't birth him. Depends how you look at it. But I think it was more interesting to me to have Alberto be a little bit of a party boy, I guess, for lack of a better term, to have someone come in who is, the prodigal son of Carmine Falcone, but that maybe Carmine himself wouldn't necessarily think of as a leader. And to have Johnny Vitti be someone who is more seasoned, who is smarter and more capable, but with a temper as well. So has his own flaws that he brings to the table. And just to try to build out the Falcone family in general. I mean, we have Luca Falcone as well, who's Carmine's brother, who is introduced in this episode. And just to give you a sense of who the Falcones are as a family versus the Maronis, who are a different family in the world of Gotham.
Well, Michael Zegen, you really are a tone setter in this show. I mean, this entire series opens up with your grisly death. So what first impression did you want to make when everybody is getting used to this world of Gotham?
We shot that scene on the very first day of the entire the entire shoot. So I was just trying to make any impression. Like we didn't have any rehearsals or anything. And I was doing this scene with Colin Farrell, which was nerve-wracking enough. And it was like 2 degrees in the studio because Colin's in all this makeup and prosthetics and he's hot. So I'm like shaking I was nervous and I'm shaking, so I was just trying to kind of get through the scene. I don't know if I was even thinking about making an impression, but I guess, overall, I think I wanted the audience to get a glimpse into who Alberto was and maybe feel a little sympathetic towards him, especially when he, gets killed. But yeah, I was just, I really, I felt like it was such an important scene because his death is the catalyst. So I wanted them to care about him in some way, shape, or form.
Well, and you also establish how people in this world treat Oz. I mean, you say a lot of mean things to him, but for me, weirdly, the most humiliating thing you say is a compliment when you say, like, a good-looking guy like you. I mean, that made me think, oh, people just treat Oz like he's dumb and blind, too.
Yeah, I think in that scene, we're trying to establish the power dynamic between the two of them. And obviously, I don't think Alberto had any respect towards Oz at all. And obviously, that changed by the end of that scene. But yeah, I think that, we're still learning about him and I don't even think, Oz talked that much in the movie. So like this was in the Batman movie. So this was like an opportunity for you to kind of get to know Oz as well.
And for Michael Kelly, I want to talk about your Johnny Vitti, who's like very on the other end of this family. I mean, when he shows up in the series, my first thought was, oh, this guy looks corporate. This guy looks like he could walk into any bank. He could go to any meeting in Silicon Valley. And you're even talking about things like outsourcing, consolidation. I got the impression that your character sees the family business as a business. Maybe doesn't take things as personally as Sophia or Oz or maybe even Alberto do.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think that he unlike a lot of people, can remove the personal from it, and see it for what it is. It is an empire. It is a business. It is big financial workings. And so, yeah, I think that's exactly what it is for him.
What do you think allows him to do that, to have that perspective?
I don't know. He's nuts, man. They're all nuts.
Great answer.
I mean, really, like if you're in that world, there is, in my opinion, if you're in that world, there is a level of crazy to you, like a big level of crazy. The fact that he can and is willing to accept the fact that any day that he goes to work, he might die. There's the people in that world, the people who think like that I don't know. I think there's something very off in the way they think.
Well, yeah, and there are moments in this episode where I have to say, I didn't think you were going to survive. Here in episode 2. I want to actually listen to, this big confrontation between you and Oz at the end of this episode.
It was you, wasn't it? You sent us dead to get massacred. What the Maronis give you, huh?
You better watch your mouth, you fucking gimp.
Fuck your mother, you dirty rat! Fuck your mother! Fuck your face, you motherfucker! Let him go! Let him go! Get the fuck off me!
Tell me about that day on set. Tell me about filming that confrontation, kind of going nose to nose with Oz.
I mean, I remember being intimidated as all get out. I mean, it's Colin Farrell. I think Colin is arguably one of the best doing it right now, of that age, right? Once you get past okay, now it's Michael Kelly and Colin Farrell playing, and Michael Kelly gets past the fact that he's actually doing a scene with Colin Farrell, and it's this crazy ass scene. Then you get into what those two characters' mindset is at that time, and Lauren did such a great job. It really is all on the page, and the way these characters feel towards one another. It's all so there, and the fact that Vidi doesn't have a great level of respect for him, I loved showing that. I love that. He's like, I don't care. He believes what he's doing is right, and Penguin believes what he's doing is right. So, there you have it. They're at odds.
I mean, in that scene, Lauren, I was really thinking about, so far in this series, you have just been a master of misdirection. I almost feel like you're having too much fun playing with my expectations. This scene in particular felt like you were doing 3-card money on us, because I was absolutely sure that they were going to search Johnny Viti and they were going to find the knife in his pocket.
Good. I'm glad you felt that way. I mean, that's something that we worked hard on in the writer's room a lot of. When you have a puzzle like that and when you're trying to misdirect the audience, it is like you're playing a game of chess a bit. And so then to break that down in the writing, you have to be very precise and very specific. It was very challenging to figure that out. So I'm glad that you felt that way. That's what we wanted you to think.
But then wait, for you, when you start writing that scene, do you know that the knife is not going to be in his pocket, or are you playing out all the scenarios and figuring out which one you like?
No, it's always with the idea of this is what we want. When we're thinking about characters, it's always starting from an emotional place of where's that character emotionally and then what drives them. Once we landed on this idea of we wanted you to believe that, Oz was able to plant something on Johnny Viti, or that we know that Johnny Viti is the target, but we don't want him to end up with it, then it becomes the sort of puzzle that you're trying to unpack.
So then if you had to say how you want to make the audience feel in that scene in like 1 or 2 words, what would you say?
Tense. I always think about tension versus reveal, right? Like you want things to, sometimes in scenes you want to lead with tension. You want people to feel stressed. And other times you're playing towards a reveal. So that has a bit of both. So I guess tension and reveal. But also, Viti and Oz, it needs to be a bit of fun too. Like they're at odds. They hate each other. Like I laugh every time I see that scene, even though it's very dark, but just in terms of the dynamic between Oz and Johnny.
Michael Kelly, your Johnny breaks the ice in this show. He is the character that says the P word, penguin, right here. Using that word really seems to say something about how your character talks about Oz behind his back. But I'm wondering, is that mostly a behind the back insult, or are people comfortable saying it to his face?
I can't speak for others, but I know that my character has no problem saying it. I don't think that he thinks much of him at all. He says it over and over again. He actually tells him how he feels about him and what he thinks about him. And I love that about my character, the fact that, and I guess it goes back to that whole thing of like living and dying. It is what it is,
Well, Lauren, what about for you? I mean, you're doing a show called The Penguin, and you've waited a whole episode to use this word. How are you thinking about that name?
Yeah, I think, Oz doesn't care for it, which is interesting that it's called The Penguin and he doesn't, embrace it. It's a derogatory term for him because he has a limp, and it's sort of a low-class thing to say to a guy like that. But, and so there is just that level of disrespect. It's a way to kind of showcase that that Johnny Vitti is not afraid of Oz, that it also kind of tells you where Oz's place is in the family, that if he was an underling to Carmine Falcone, well, Carmine Falcone's dead.
Was there ever a debate about not calling the show The Penguin, calling it Oz Cobb?
No, because, can't wait to watch Oz Cobb, the show. From the director of The Batman comes Oz Cobb. And you're like, what? Who's Oz Cobb? Because even that was, we changed his name to be more grounded versus Cobblepot, since Cobblepot's not really a real person's name. And it was really important to make sure that our version of Oz, just like our show, is very grounded.
Lauren, you have set me up for every email from anybody named Cobblepot, anybody in the universe.
Who's named Cobblepot?
If you're out there, let me know.
I know. I'm curious, too. I'm pretty confident, though, there's not a Cobblepot that exists, which is what makes him unique. I love Oz Cobblepot. I mean, I grew up, with comic books. So, but I think there's something that we do in the show that's interesting in terms of the term the Penguin and when the show evolves.
Well, Michael Kelly, I want to ask, you were nominated for multiple Emmys playing the loyal chief of staff on House of Cards. Are you enjoying flexing your dark side?
I was scared to death, I'll be honest. Like,
Really?
I was really, really incredibly intimidated to take on the role because of the accent and because of that world that's been created already, that character has been created already so brilliantly by him. I was scared, man. I think I have a little bit of fear before I start every job, because I don't want to say I don't practice. I don't run lines with anyone. I just have to just put it all into my head, and then I just go and I do it, right? So I was just really scared. And I'm like, oh my God, am I too big? Am I too, it's just all the insecurities that actors have, I guess.
Well, we were excited. I mean, I was excited. Like, truly, I was like, when, we're looking for Johnny Vitti, I'm like, oh my God, Michael Kelly would be amazing.
It's funny you say that, because when we did the table read, you remember that
oh, yeah.
that really cool thing that he did, right?
What was the really cool thing that he did?
It was one of the coolest things I've ever seen at a table read. First of all, the table read was insane and the biggest production I've ever seen. There was probably 50 plus people.
There were a lot of people there.
Around one table? I want to make sure I'm picturing this.
It was a large table, many tables combined.
A big U-shaped table with giant screens in the middle for people who were zooming in from other parts of the world. There was the Maserati was in the corner. It was a production. Anyway, Colin comes in and he couldn't have been nicer. Big hug and just, hey, what's up? It's so nice to meet you. And he's talking as Colin with the accent and everything, right? And then they're like, okay, we're ready, guys. And so we go to reading. He's next to me or two down from me, I don't remember. And I see him pull out this black ski mask and put it on over his head with just the eyes and the mouth cut out. And he became the Penguin. And I was like, oh shit, that was so baller. That's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And I was like, in my head, like, we're doing the reading and I'm just going, as an actor, I'm asking myself, why do you do that? Why is he doing that? And my assumption, I would love to hear his take on it, is that, he is this beautiful human being. Colin's got to be one of the most handsome dudes you've ever seen. And he has this beautiful accent. And if he read it with that accent and you're looking at Colin Farrell and not, it allowed you to imagine whatever you wanted to imagine the Penguin was. And I was just like, that's one of the coolest things I have ever seen. And then he took it off. He's like, all right, mate. He's back his accent. He's like, oh my God, you're so cool.
Well, Michael Zegen, do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Again, I was nervous out of my mind. I usually get very nervous for table reads, especially. But yeah, seeing him with that mask was amazing. And again, it's just like Colin Farrell sitting right next to me. Like, how can I even concentrate? So it was actually a good thing he was wearing that mask.
Totally.
Lauren, did you know he was going to do that?
No. But it was great. I mean, I thought it was really inspired, honestly, because, he wears a prosthetic. And when he's Oz, part of his character is that he's behind a different man's face, quite literally, in a very unique way, I think, than most actors get to experience in their career. When I write Oz, I've only ever thought of Oz. it's a very strange thing. I mean, I think I can't speak for you guys, but when you're acting opposite him, you're acting opposite Oz in a way. I mean, it's Colin. We all know it's Colin, but he's coming to set as a very different looking person.
Oh my God.
And I heard that he was keeping the accent, at least, even if he was Colin. Actually, all of you have brought up this Gotham accent. I want to hear more about that. What is that? How would you describe it?
Yeah,
You could probably tell me
Jessica Drake,
better.
who is Colin's dialect coach, who has worked with him, I think, for 10 years, the two of them on The Batman came up, they created this accent based on different things, and it's very interesting, and Colin or Jessica could speak to it better, just the different history that they pulled from different regions. So it's not quite New York, it's not quite New Jersey, it's sort of like a strange combination, and they worked on that together. And then Dee Dee, as Frances, had to have the exact same accent. But Kristen, for instance, and Michael Zegen, they have an accent that's more of, they're of they're of a different class within Gotham City. So their accent's different. Like Michael Kelly speaks differently. Like everyone speaks slightly differently depending on where in Gotham they're from, or if they came from outside Gotham, grew up outside Gotham. So across the board, we had dialect coaches on all of our episodes, and it made it very precise and specific. And those little details, I think, really it makes quite a difference when you think about it.
What is outside Gotham? Like what are the suburbs of Gotham like?
Well, Oz is from East Gotham, the East Side.
Okay.
So he has sort of his own specific accent. And then, the Falcones are kind of sort of the equivalent of Long Island, I suppose.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So that's slightly different. And then, even in the film, like Bella Real or Gordon, they have a more sort of standard American accent. So it's all very specific who should sound like what in terms of where people come from and what, where they grew up and things like that.
Hearing about Colin in this moment, putting on the ski mask, making himself physically feel like he's inhabiting this character, even at a table read. I'm curious for the both of you, how you felt when you first put on your character's wardrobe. Like, is that a thing that really helps inform how you're acting, your choices that you're going to make?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Lauren talked about it with me and Craig. And I went for costume fittings, and they were trying all these kind of very flamboyant sort of gothic, sort of, I don't know, like it was a lot of black, and the tattoo was big. I don't know if you noticed I had a tattoo on my chest.
Wait, no, I don't think I got a full look at it. What is that tattoo?
It's a falcon, for Falcone. And it's on my chest. It kind of like peeks through my clothes a little bit, my undershirt. But I felt it. So that's all that really mattered. Especially like when you haven't had much rehearsal and you just kind of show up and they put you in something and you're just like, oh, okay, I get it now.
What about you, Michael Kelly?
100%. It really helped me see more of this character who I had a pretty good idea in my head of who he was. But then you do that fitting and you're just like, oh my God, and everything was just like that. Everything so sharp and to the nines and very expensive, nice clothing that Vidi wears. And then you put on the pinky ring and the jewelry and the watch and you're like, I get it. And it really made me be very aware of it on set for all of the characters, and seeing, especially Kristen, just her costumes were just fantastic. Helen crushed it. She crushed it.
Yeah,
and
Helen's
she helped
incredible.
me a lot.
Yeah.
I have kind of a silly question I just want to throw out there. Michael Zegen, you have played Bugsy Siegel before, and I'm curious, what would he make of the Falcone family?
He'd probably think they were too boring. I don't know. He was, I think he'd probably think they take things way too seriously. Because Bugsy was more of a, hothead. He was a performer. He was less into drugs, more into violence. So yeah, I think he would just think they were kind of dull.
Ooh, how does that make you feel, Michael Kelly?
Perfectly fine. I'm a businessman. Dull is exactly what I want to hear. If you're dull, you're not on the bad guys, the authorities' radar, right?
Yeah.
All right, well, guys, this has been such a fun conversation.
Thank you so much, y'all.
Yeah, thanks.
Next up, we are glad to have production designer Kalina Ivanov and supervising art director Deborah Wheatley. Hello, ladies. Welcome to our glamorously designed recording studio.
Hello. So great to be here today.
Well, so just to set the table, how would you explain the different jobs that each of you had in building the look of the Penguin?
I think the easiest way to describe it is if Kalina, the production designer, is the dreamer, then I, as the supervising art director, is really the manifester. So I take everything that Kalina wants and all of her visions and drawings and conversation with the director, and I work with all of the creatives, the set designer, construction, scenic, set deck, to make those dreams become a reality. And I see through the entire build process of every set, from budgeting to calendars and scheduling and materials purchases and dealing with vendors to make those things ready to be filmed for the rest of the team.
Wow. So,
And yeah, think of it this way. If I'm an architect, Debbie is my engineer. I actually had a logo pasted on my door saying daydreamer. So she's absolutely correct that I am the daydreamer, and she comes to bring me to earth. She comes back and says, maybe we need to reconsider this or whatever we're talking about. But she really helps me make the dreams that I have into a reality, into real sets and stuff.
well, so I want to talk about those dreams and those realities, because an interesting thing about the Penguin is, this is not like y'all just walked onto the set of The Batman and took over this world. I mean, that was filmed in London. This is filmed in America. This is a different neighborhood. I mean, set up the challenges here of putting your own stamp on this particular show, this version of the world.
Yeah, I have to. Okay, so the Batman is designed brilliantly by James Chinland, who also happens to be a friend, and he is incredible designer. And so, of course, stepping into the Penguin, I was a bit concerned about having to follow the Batman. In our very first creative conversation with Matt Reeves and Lauren LeFranc, it became very clear that we would keep the spirit of the Batman, but we will actually go in a slightly different direction. And that was because Matt Reeves' manifesto to us was to think of this project as French Connection meets Scarface. And so these are very powerful concepts, visual concepts. And so the first thing we talked about is using New York as the basis for Gotham. And what you find in French Connection is, of course, the subways, and being underneath the subways is very important.
Those
So
famous car chases underneath the subways. Yeah.
Correct.
Yep.
So we ended up looking for so many locations that are under passes and under tunnels and under highways and under the subway. It became such a major theme, and arches, because obviously tunnels and a subway have a lot of arches involved. So the shape of the arches became an overriding design theme. And then we developed the idea of Crown Point neighborhood, and the whole idea that the Penguin is on the ground and everything needed to be from the point of view of the ground looking up, versus the Batman who flies above and looks from everything above looking down. And so it was a very interesting approach and quite liberating to us, because we were starting 6 days. The story starts 6 days after the Riddler bombs go off.
I mean, that actually, as you're describing it, I'm really picturing the images that I've seen so far in the show that you're describing. I really get that sense, actually. And Debbie, I mean, there's so much visual detail in the show that goes unspoken. These glimpses that we're getting of Gotham that I think are telling us about what has happened to the city, the destruction, the tension, the missing person posters, the protesters holding signs at a funeral. I mean, tell me about these details you're creating to tell us about Gotham that aren't even necessarily said out loud by anybody.
What we really wanted people to understand in contrast to the Batman, which is, you know, politicians and Bruce Wayne and the wealthy, is that the Penguin is really about the people at the very bottom of the economic class system. And that you see that and what this flood and the destruction has caused around them. And you get sort of an echo of a dysfunctional government. So a big storyline that we brought in very early as a visual was this idea that FEMA is on the ground. And a lot of this research came directly from Katrina and the failures of FEMA to meet the needs of people. And so, for instance, in this episode, you see the chase sequence where the Penguin has stolen a FEMA truck. And throughout the series, you'll see dumpsters where flood debris has been thrown in. You'll see posters that have been graffitied over that are like government related posters. And the idea that the very bottom class of Gotham has been betrayed by their government and they're not supported and given the things that they need to function. And Penguin is all about coming out of this, and how does he rise out of his own circumstance of being lower class to get to where he wants to be. And so that grit, that dirt, seeing the flood lines on buildings in the background and being reminded of sort of like the level of devastation that the Riddler had brought about is such an integral and textural part of our storyline that continues to show like there's this wet and this mold and this like growing decay of Gotham that represents so much of who Penguin is and where he's coming from in these stories.
And Amy, I can just tell you that it was very personal to me because when Hurricane Sandy hit, I live on the east side, and my neighborhood was one of the last neighborhoods to get its electricity restored.
Oh, wow.
Where the Upper East Side was on day one was restored, and some people never even lost electricity.
So you lived this Crown Point life.
Yes, and it's very personal, and so it was really interesting to look into that, to actually feel it in your bones.
Let's go inside the characters' houses for a bit. I want to hear about Oz living inside of a bank vault. I mean, did he move a bank vault into a normal apartment? Is he living in a bank? Tell me about this choice.
It is a jeweler's repair shop.
Oh.
So where it came from is the fact that he lived in the Diamond District. Lauren LeFranc wrote Diamond District. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about Oz's loft, and I was just thinking, well, one thing we knew is that he wasn't going to be very high up. So we agreed that he would be on a second or a third story. But one of the things I was thinking of is like when you go in the Diamond District, the bottom floor is all the fancy stores and where you see the sparkly jewelry. But what happens on the second and the third story is all the repair jewelry shops and all the smaller businesses that goes behind the big fancy stores on the ground level. And I pitched the idea that he would take over a jeweler's repair shop. And by the way, there is a poster framed that shows the history of the shop in one corner.
Where am I supposed to look for that? I want to find that.
Well, if only the camera would lovingly linger over it.
But you know it's there, and now I know it's there. Now we all know that it's there.
Yeah.
I mean, what did Colin say when he walked into the place?
So Colin was our producer and very involved in the process of making the project. I had a design conversation with him where I actually showed him the entire design book. And he absolutely loved the idea of living in the jeweler's repair shop and why that was the vault. So it does work like a bank vault. You are correct. It's just happens not to be a bank vault.
I just
It's
haven't
a
spent enough
jeweler's
time
vault.
around diamonds. I get it. I need to spend more time around diamonds.
Yes, and he absolutely loved it, and he gave us references for Oz's bed paintings, and so the very big painting that is kind of purplish with the circles and stuff is very similar to a reference of abstract art that he sent us. He was very involved, and I remember he asked me, "Can I take the design book?" And I said, "Of course." So he took the design book with him, and then showed it to his mom, played by Deidre Connell, the character of Frances. And then she came to my office, and then I spent time with her and her character, and it was kind of awesome. It was really wonderful to spend time with these actors and create the characters and have their input in it.
I actually really like Oz's apartment. I like the checkerboard tile. I like the gold lamps. I like the fireplace. I like that it's a fake fireplace. That seems really easy to me. That all feels like it would belong to a guy who has his car painted plum. And wait, I have to ask this even. What is the difference between purple and plum?
I think it's like rectangle, square, like all plums are purple, but not all purple is plum kind of thing.
Well, so I guess what I'm admitting then is that that's a little bit my wheelhouse as well. But the Falcones estate, that speaks to just a whole other different level of like wealth,
Correct.
style, way of life. Tell me about that.
So the interesting thing is that Oz wants to be Falcone. That's his aspiration, but he doesn't have the taste. Where Falcone, Carmine, is a very polished gangster. He is somebody that is generations of gangsters who has now amassed wealth and he wants to rub shoulders with George Clooney and Brad Pitt at this point.
I mean, who doesn't want to rub shoulders with George Clooney and Brad Pitt?
Yes, their version, the Gotham version of those two. But the idea was that it was generations of mobsters, and that's why I started with finding first the location for the mansion. Once I knew that, I could then design the interior, right? And so very early in the process, when our location manager, Keith, and I were scouting, we found this incredible mansion that is from the Gatsby era. And it looked like an Italian villa. And I remember pitching it very early on to Lauren and to Matt. And they thought it looked a little bit too stern. And I said, well, that's exactly what I like about it. I like the elegance, the simplicity of the shapes. We can add a fountain to it. We can add all sorts of greens, and we can make it more polished. But I love the fact that it's good taste. Good taste is simpler. The simple lines are good taste. And then when we went inside that location, it was a chock full of wonderful detail, period detail that inspired us. And we created some of it, but not really all of it. But the interesting part of it is the owner's mother still lives in Italy, and they had these Renaissance paintings panels, and I was thinking, oh, I love this, but I want to make it at frescoes. I really want to make it pre-perspective, pre-Renaissance, right on the cusp of Renaissance. So I looked at art in the 1400s versus 1500s. So I looked at art.
What's the difference between 14 versus 15?
So when perspective was invented, paintings became much more realistic, and perspective, when people realized how to use perspective for their paintings, which is when you think about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and Caravaggio, right before that period, things tend to be a little bit awkward. The human figure to the buildings is a bit awkward because it's not in the proper perspective. They're not using the perspective grids. But they're magical to me. They're very interesting. So I look at Montaigne. There's a really interesting painter from that period that I looked at his frescoes. He was right on the cusp, so not primitive enough, but they're not also, Leonardo da Vinci, which we later we used some Leonardo da Vinci into the kitchen. But there was a lot of pre-Renaissance and Renaissance influence. But
I had this thought though, Kalina. It's tasteful, but it kind of struck me as a little impersonal. Debbie, I was kind of debating as I was watching it, whether all of this beautiful stuff was there because they enjoy it or just to impress everyone else who comes to visit.
I think it's a combination of both. I think it's about showing the family's stature. And when we contrast that to Oz, we see in the Falcone mansion, we have Venetian plaster walls. We have limestone, which gives you a cold but voluminous sort of sense of the space, where Penguin's space is, it's drywall and exposed brick. It's very rudimentary in terms of like the architectural materials that you see. So the Falcones are really trying to push for their stature. So the ceilings are very tall and the space feels very cold and ominous as like a power move for them. But it's also about saying, we have this fresco that we imported from Italy that was shipped over to us directly and, is from the 1400s because they can. And they have the money and the power to do that, where Penguin has none of that. He's getting his paintings from the Gotham street market because he thinks they look nice, but they aren't necessarily of any true artistic value to his space.
I'd love to hear just some of the little details, the little Easter eggs, the little signifiers that we should be looking out for that you just really, really hope that people notice. I mean, I'll throw out one for myself, which is probably more of a costuming thing, but according to Vic's sweatshirt in this episode, Gotham has a basketball team. Never knew that.
Gotham has a basketball team, they have a football team, they have a baseball team. There's a whole ecosystem of Gotham that is created and hidden within signage and the world around. There are multiple newspapers that Gotham Press puts out. Some of this comes to us from the Batman, and the world is just even further expanded. So while we are in a very grounded, realistic, gritty world that doesn't ever get too comic booky, we wanted to pay homage to the huge fans. So in a later episode, you'll see a very important train car that is numbered 58, which is the first Batman comic book that the Penguin appears in. In episode 1, Alberto comes out of a club door and it's Club 41, which is the year that Penguin first became a villain in the Batman series. There are other little shops and stores and character names that are kind of littered throughout the art of the world that are like nods to the big Batman Penguin fans throughout.
So, Kalina, it sounds like we should just be freeze framing all the time.
Yes.
and look what that jeweler's ad.
Yep.
You guys, this was such a fun conversation. I'm really glad we got to hang out. Episode 2 ends with Oz and Sophia teaming up, or as Oz says, let's dance. But how much can she or we trust him? That's the big question. But for now, a partnership makes sense. They're both underdogs. They're both undervalued by their families. They can, at the very least, use each other until they decide they might have an even better move. So my big question is, who's going to make a deadly mistake? This was an OBB Sound production and hosted by me, Amy Nicholson. Executive producers for OBB Sound are Michael D. Ratner, Scott Ratner, Arlen Konopacki, and Elias Tanner. Produced by Toby Lawless. Production manager is Brian Burgett. Engineered by Josh Falcon. Our editor and mixer is also Josh Falcon. Booking coordinator is Tess Bartholomew. Research producer is Jesse Holland. Executive producers for HBO are Becky Rowe and Savon Slater. Executives in charge of production for DC are Mike Pilata and Victor Diaz.